Hi, everybody, and welcome back to HSE 542, Foundations of Human Systems Engineering. Today we'll start our discussion of cognitive resources. Actually, we'll start our discussion of cognitive psychology. We'll start by talking about cognitive resources, kind of the fuel available for us to be able to do things like thinking and learning and memory and decision making and all of those kinds of things. We'll also start by talking about attention. So this particular video will get us as far as attention, and future videos will cover other components of cognition. So I thought this was a telling image. In 1920, 8-year-old Samuel Reshevsky played chess with several chess masters at once. He lost every single game. That's exactly how cognitive resources work. If you're trying to do multiple things at multiple times, of course, you're going to lose every single time. And that is the problem with cognition. In terms of cognitive resources, our so-called fuel to make decisions and to learn and so forth, it's really limited. And that's exactly what young Samuel found out. So cognition refers to perceiving, thinking, remembering, reasoning, and problem solving. That's from Ulrich Neisser in 1967. And the critical part about cognition is our ability to do these things is really limited. So we can only pay attention to a small amount of information at once, and it's really difficult to think of two things at once. So what happens is if you attempt to do more than one thing, that will deplete your mental energy, or what's often referred to as your cognitive resources. The issue is, of course, that we encounter information much faster than we can possibly process it. We're constantly bombarded by stimuli in our environment, and we need to figure out how to make sense of that. And one of the ways we do it is by determining what we pay attention to. Further, information processing, taking all this information and dealing with it, figuring out what to do about it, makes us really tired. So what's happening is our neurons are really living cells. In fact, they use an awful lot of our resources. So manufacturing, dispersing, reuptaking brain chemicals, all of that stuff takes just tremendous energy. As I said, neurons are living cells. Each has a metabolism. They need oxygen, they need glucose, they need rest to survive, just like other muscles and so forth. And when they work hard, we tend to get fatigued. So to give you an idea of how dire this is, the entire brain weighs about 3 pounds or so. So it's only a small percentage of an adult's total body weight, about 2%. On the other hand, it consumes 20% of all of our energy that the body uses. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex uses even more percentage-wise than that. That's the thing that enables us to help make decisions and control impulses and so forth, what we often think of as executive function. So to survive, neural communication has to be rapid, of course, and neurons communicate with each other a whole bunch of times every second. And even an hour of relaxing or wandering, I should say, requires about 11 calories. Light mental activity, about 42 calories, that is, per hour. Absorbing new information, about 65 calories per hour. And, that takes up a lot of calories over time. Eating or drinking glucose, interestingly, improves our performance on mentally demanding tasks, which is one of the ways we know exactly how expensive metabolically the brain is. So these limitations, the fact that we can only take in so much and do so much with information at any one time, is really one of the main challenges for design, because we would love to just provide people with more and more information, hoping they can make more and more decisions and everything would just be delightful, but that's not how it works. In fact, we have to kind of feed information to people in just the right amounts for them to really make use of it. So for example, how do we attract attention when everything else in our world is trying to attract attention? You see that all the time, even just driving down the highway. You're driving down the highway trying not to get into an accident, but at the same time you might be tuning the radio or responding to a text, hopefully not, and seeing billboards and everything else. There's an awful lot vying for your attention. Next, how do we get people to interact successfully with our devices or our products, yet still have cognitive resources remaining to interact, say, with a patient if it's a healthcare situation, but it might be with a customer in another situation, or just plain information, data that they need to use in order to make decisions. And how do we present data in a way that informs rather than overwhelms? And in order to do that, we need to know some things about cognition, but specifically about attention. So I've been kind of holding off on showing this to you, but I think it's time for us to walk through this. This obviously is a model. This is not your brain. Of course, if we were to look at how all this gets done physiologically, it's all done by neural communication, which is electrical and chemical, of course. But imagine we use this model. As you know, every model is wrong, but some models are useful. I hope you'll find this model useful as well. So on the left-hand side, we can see sensory stimuli coming in here. These stimuli are coming in through the eyes and the ears and touch and taste and smell and so forth. How do you like that nose down there? Pretty good, right? So through smell and so forth. And that information all gets captured in this. You can sort of think about it as a really short-term storage called sensory register or sensory memory. That sensory memory sticks around for just the briefest period of time, but just about everything gets in there. So we might get all of these sensory inputs in there, but they stick around for a second or so and then they're fleeting, they're gone. On the other hand, some of those sensory stimuli we decide are important to us. They might be important for our survival. They might be kind of louder and more startling than other things. They might be important for the task we're doing. So that kind of information, just a little bit of it, we come up here and we assign some attention to. And when we assign attention to some of these sensory stimuli, and we bind that with knowledge that happens in working memory. So think about this as bottom-up processing, and this is top-down processing, right? When we pay attention, we have the opportunity to perceive that information, to recognize that information, and to attempt to make sense of that information. That's what perception is doing. So again, we get stimuli. This is in the form of light waves and so forth that might reach our retina, or sound waves, for example, basically the expansion and contraction of air pressure that's hitting our cochlea, etc. All of that enters into this kind of sensory register very briefly. If some of that is important enough to us, or at least we seem to think it's important enough, that will be perceived. And it's perceived for two reasons. One is we attach attention to it, we pay attention to it, and we use our long-term memory, knowledge basically, to help recognize it. That's what perception is. Once we perceive something, there's all kinds of things we can do with it. Right now, you have the opportunity for it to move on to thought or decision making. That is, to make it into working memory. Working memory, you can sort of think about everything that we're thinking of right this moment. So I like to think of working memory is, oh gosh, I used to have a great way of saying it. Let me see if I can remember. Working memory is what we think about when we think about thinking. Okay, try that again. Working memory is what we think about when we think about thinking. So when we think about thinking, we often think about, oh, what's going on in my mind right now? What's happening right this possible second? That's what's basically the contents of your working memory. So you will see working memory is, we'll get into all the details about this, whether you like it or not. Working memory is, the contents of it is what we've just recently perceived, as well as long-term memory that we've brought to bear, that is, that we're recalling at a particular time. Okay, you will notice that this decision-making component and working memory, in order for information to stay in there, that requires attention. Sometimes you can pass over this really fast, like when you step in front of a truck and you recognize really quickly, I better step the heck back. That can be kind of direct without a whole lot of thought and decision making going on. So you can see this other thing here that kind of passes that. Okay, once we've thought about what we're seeing, what we're doing, we often need to choose some way of responding to it. That is, we need to select our response. I've got to move something here while I'm talking to you because it's driving me crazy. I think that worked. Okay. So over here, this is where we choose our response. How is it that we're going to respond? What are we going to do, etc.? And then after we choose, of course, we execute that response. And then finally, we get some activity. We can also have a feedback loop that indicates what was the response of that activity. And that, of course, feeds back into our sensory register through our senses and so forth. Okay, so that's perceptual encoding, central processing, responding, all of these components. Here's the thing I want you to know about. You will notice that attention is used in all of these darn things, and we don't have a lot of it. So for a designer, the key is to be able to have enough attention for people to perceive the things they need to perceive, to still be able to make thoughts and decision making, have thoughts and make decisions, I should say, to respond and to execute. Attention is critical through all of these, and the bummer of it is that we've only got so much attention to go around. So let's talk more about attention. Of course, before I get to attention, I should mention this sensory register business that I talked to you about. Here is the sensory register. I said a whole bunch of information goes on in there, but it sticks around just a little bit of time. So an example of that is we have something called iconic memory. That is, our visual system has a sensory register, and that sensory register keeps information and then after seeing something for a very, very brief period of time. And you'll notice that sometimes if you do something like, you can kind of tell this memory. If you take a, oh gosh, what do you call those things? On 4th of July, you use a sparkler. There we go. When you use a sparkler, and you turn it, you spin it around really, really fast, it looks like it's making circles. But in fact, what's really happening is it's really not making a circle. It's just a continuous light thing. It's just spinning so fast that your brain fills in the blanks of what was there previously. So you actually feel like you see something, like a continuous circle of light, when in fact you're just perceiving what's currently going on, and your memory is filling in the blank of what's just happened in the last half a second or so. So here's a little bit more about this sensory register. And this isn't the critical part here. I really want to focus on attention, but what the heck, let's talk about this a little bit. Sensory register, or what we call sometimes sensory memory, holds a whole bunch of information for a really short period of time. So it collects information and holds just enough for us to process it and kind of fill in the blanks. But if we don't pay attention to that piece of information, it just goes away. There's actually 3 stores, at least 3, of sensory memory. Iconic memory is kind of visual. Echoic memory is auditory, and haptic memory is touch. And you can see they have different levels of duration. So iconic memory usually sticks around for about a second or so, haptic memory for less than a second, and echoic memory about 5 to 10 seconds or so. I often talk about how helpful echoic memory has been to me. So I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, maybe your parents have, but I'll be sitting around watching football. Imagine it's a Saturday, and I really like college football. And imagine I'm watching football, and my wife comes by, and she says, "Russ, I'm going out to the store, and then I'm going to do, the next thing, I'm going to go to the bank, and then I'm going to swing by and visit one of the kids, and then I'll see you after that." I say, "Okay, great. Okay, see ya." And then she'll look at me, and she'll say, "Russ, you didn't hear a word I just said, did you?" And of course, I did, but I'm also watching the football game, And I'm able to say, "Oh yeah, you're going shopping, and you're going to see the kids, and you're going to do something else, going to the bank." I can parrot that back really fast. The only reason I can parrot that back really fast, the fact is I hadn't been paying attention, but it's football time. Because my auditory or echoic memory is a 5 to 10 second duration, and she asked me within that 5 to 10 seconds, and I'm able to recall it. It's been a great help to me many, many times. And I don't think I want to tell her exactly why that happens. Okay, so now we've talked about this sensory register, right? Iconic memory, echoic memory, haptic memory, etc. Probably an olfactory memory and so on. We get there, next we go to perception, but we can only get to perception if we decide to attend to something, to pay attention to it. So let's talk about attention. This might be helpful, although it might have to involve some shenanigans for you to be able to see it. I'm hoping we'll be able to capture this. Let me see if I can show you this demo real quick. I'm going to have to do it this way. This is a Coursera course, by the way, this particular one. And let's see if we can get away with showing you this.
The difference between these two men seems obvious. Their faces are different, their hair is different, even their shirts are a different color. And yet an experiment by psychologists Dan Simons and Chris Chabris at Harvard reveals that our brains actually process very little of what comes in through the eyes.
In this experiment, a subject comes up to a counter and a first experimenter hands them a consent form. As soon as they finish signing the consent form, they hand it back to the first experimenter, who then takes the consent form, ducks down behind the counter to put it away, and a different experimenter then stands up and hands the subject a packet of information and sends them into a hallway where we ask them questions about it.
This wonderful experiment uncovers an aspect of the brain's attention system known as change blindness.
Change blindness is the idea that we often miss large changes to our visual world from one view to the next. We're often not able to see large changes that would appear to be perfectly obvious to somebody who knows they're going to happen.
And incredibly, in 75% of cases, the subjects don't notice a thing.
The lady who took me up here, she opened the door for me and told me to walk over to the desk. I think there was a sign that said experiment. Mm-hmm. And a man there gave me a form to sign.
Mm-hmm. There was the guy standing under a big sign that said experiment. Mm-hmm. And to my left, there was like a pot with some dirt in it and some plastic containers.
Oh, I filled out a form.
Okay.
Right.
How long would it be about before
And I asked him how long it would take. He said about 10, 15 minutes or so.
I guess I have the time.
Did you notice anything unusual at all after you signed the consent form?
I just signed it, and I didn't even pay attention to anything that was written on it.
Okay. After you handed it back to him, did you notice anything unusual happen at all?
If you could just take this into the next
No,
one.
no, I probably wasn't even looking that direction. I probably turned and looked towards the clear door. I saw some people there.
Okay.
Then I turned back and looked at him for a second.
Okay. Did you notice anything unusual at all after you signed the consent form?
No.
This is only going to take 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, it'll be real short.
Okay.
The person who stood up was actually a different person.
Okay.
I gather you didn't notice that was different? A different person actually stood up and handed you this form and sent you out toward me. I gather from your reaction you didn't notice that?
No.
Okay. Don't feel bad about that. Actually, most of the time, we find about 75% of people don't notice.
You serious?
Yeah. The person who stood up with the packet was actually a different person
Wow.
than the first person.
That is incredible.
So I gather you didn't see it then.
I didn't catch that, no.
Okay.
What's really interesting is that some people notice these changes.
Okay, so hopefully you were able to see that correctly. I should mention a couple things. So that was just replaying something from Coursera here in one of their classes. And this was Scott Plause's class. He's a professor at Wesleyan University in social psychology, really strong psychologist. In fact, he has a book on, if I recall right, I think it's Judgment and Decision Making or something like that. Small read that might be worth taking a look at if you get a chance. I know I was impressed with it when I read it. But so I thought I would talk a little bit about that situation. There's one on the next page. I won't go into details, but feel free to play it yourself if you want to. But that was really interesting, right? These are things where people are looking directly at the person, obviously their eyes fixated on that person, and still they didn't recognize giant changes. Very surprising. You probably have seen the similar type of demonstration with the gorilla, where you have to count the number of passes a particular team makes with the basketball, and you're counting and focus so hard on it, even though your eyes fixate on that gorilla as they walk through. What happens is a gorilla walks through the scene, the person in a gorilla suit. You fixate on it, it never gets selected by your attention, so it never makes it into perception. So it makes it into your sensory register, interestingly, but because you were focused on a task so hard, you were kind of in tunnel vision, so to speak, at least attentionally, that you didn't even perceive it. That's what ends up happening about 75% of the time. Okay, so this is what attention is. It's the narrow focus of consciousness required to, 1, perceive stimuli. That is, we can't perceive something we don't pay attention to. Focus on important information and filter out the distractions around us. If there's no attention, we get no perception. That's all there is to it. Some conspicuous stimuli, loud sounds, bright lights, things that might kill us, for example, grab our attention automatically without doing a lot about it. But it's also the case that our brain tends to get used to or habituate to current situations, and as a result, changes from the current situations attract our attention, and we'll talk about some of those as we go along. Okay, it's required for almost every mental activity, but it's scarce. So when we pay attention to one thing, it means we generally have to take attention away from something else. We need it to perceive stimuli, as I mentioned. We need it to make judgments. All of those kinds of things up here requires our attention. Now, it turns out that we're not actively paying incredible amounts of attention to things all at once. In fact, about 30% of the time, we're in what we call a default mode, where we're not generally paying attention to much at all. They call that mind wandering, but that's the default mode, kind of mind wandering about 30% of the time. And that helps us recover from our intense cognitive work. It turns out it's really important. Like I said, the brain is using a whole lot of glucose, a whole lot of energy. And as a result, you need this time of mind wandering, about a third of the time, in order to kind of reset and give those brain cells a little bit of a rest. Now, I mentioned mind wandering mode. The opposite of that is kind of focused attention. So we often have many things vying for our attention at once. So we try to process multiple sources at the same time. Sometimes it doesn't work, but we can force ourselves to focus on something important or relevant, and that's called focused attention. What ends up happening is, imagine you're on a particular task that you're trying to solve. What ends up happening is this focused attention changes the sensitivity of neurons so that they fire in relation to task-relevant situations, and they kind of suppress other kinds of stimuli, things that are not task-relevant. There's an attentional system called the central executive that I alluded to before, which prevents you from being distracted when you're really engaged in a task. That central executive operates in direct opposition. As I said, it's just the opposite of the mind-wandering mode by limiting what enters consciousness so you can focus on what you're doing. So there's also selective attention, which is attending to and perceiving one thing while ignoring others. And it's hard to know, well, you might ask, I should say, how people know what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. It turns out we prioritize our input, basically, what we pay attention to, as best we can based on 4 factors. 1, salience. And what I mean by that is, does it help us in our current task? Salient stimuli are distinct, they're loud, they're large, etc. Certain stimuli tend to stand out because they are unlike others in their surroundings, etc. Also, we pay attention to things that are easier to pay attention to. It's easier to pay attention to things that don't require much effort. If the stimulus, for example, is directly in front of our face, it requires very little effort for us to attend to because it's right there. We don't have to go look for it or anything. Further, we're frugal with our energy, so we're more likely to scan short distances rather than long ones, especially when we're fatigued. We pay attention to things that we expect to see. So we pay attention to places where we expect to find valuable information, which is absolutely critical to you guys as designers, because it tells you that the more you can place things where people typically see those things, the more you can place items in relationship to each other so that those things that are most related or most similar are clustered together and separated away from those things that are least related and least similar, well, that aids our attention by aiding expectancy. And then I should say I misspoke a moment ago when I talked about salience involving those things that are kind of task relevant. That's partially true, but really value is the thing that focuses on whether something is task relevant. So salience is whether it's distinct or loud, etc. Value is, hey, we're in the middle of a task. I want to be able to pay attention to things that I need to use in order to get that task done. So here are some things we can do to improve attention. For example, we can always have the same information in the same place that enables us to guide our attention, etc. So here's some examples of how to improve attention. One of the ways is really to focus on things like situations that are different. As I mentioned, often we can attend to something that's different than other things. So imagine two displays, a bunch of gauges, for example, one on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side. The one on the left-hand side, let's imagine that these are all perfectly normal sort of readings. So yes, this thing should be up at about 11 o'clock, and this should be at about 11 o'clock, and this should be over here about 3, 10, etc. But those are all sort of within the limits of where you want them to be. You're perfectly happy if you're flying along and your gauges read this, that tells you you're correct. The problem is you have to go through and look at every single one of those things to make sure every single one's correct. Now imagine we normalized this or standardized it so that we always had the ideal state pointing directly up to 12 o'clock. So basically all we're doing is rescaling those numbers over here so that the best number always pointed up, the ideal always pointed up towards 12 o'clock. Now we can look at this thing really easily and see that, okay, which one looks like it's out of bounds with all the others? And it's this one here that's at 11 o'clock. So you can see it's much easier to attend to this situation, and it's much easier for this gauge to attract your attention than it is to have to scan all of these things. It's very similar to chunking in some ways, right? Because over here, you have to entertain each one of these things as a separate function. Over here, we're looking at the whole thing and we see, okay, which one is not like the others? Clutter is the same sort of issue, right? And when it comes to the design of products and so forth, the better you're able to cluster things together, the easier it is to know where to pay attention. And in fact, this really reduces the number of places you need to pay attention. If you're looking up here, there's sort of 4 clusters that you could kind of attend to. And then you could zero in on one of the particular, gauge if you wanted to after that. Whereas this thing, you really don't have any idea of where you ought to be directing your attention. So in a lot of ways, design is about figuring out how to guide people's attention. Well, the designer here did a much better job of that, even though it's not perfect, right, than the designer here. So I covered this quite a bit in the book, but multitasking. Wouldn't it be great if we could do a whole bunch of things at once and we were just incredibly efficient human beings? We spend a whole lot of our time in life trying to become more and more efficient. And I've decided that it's a fool's errand. It's really difficult, if not impossible, to multitask. So at any time, our attention can be either selective or divided. When it's selective, we're paying attention to only one task or a source of information. When it's divided, we're really in trouble because what we try to do is allocate attention between tasks. That ends up causing interference with each task, and we do both of them pretty darn poorly. What's worse is it's costly, metabolically, to switch tasks. Every time we move from one thing to another, there's a big sort of startup cost, you can think about it, in your brain, almost like starting up your car uses more gas and electricity when it first starts. Well, the same darn thing happens when we switch from task to task. It causes the brain to consume extra glucose. If we do that time and time again, we get exhausted and even disoriented over time. It depletes the nutrients in the brain. It's just bad. So multitasking requires repeated decision making about which tasks to focus on and when. What's really interesting about this is you would think that, well, making a big decision would use a lot more resources than making a small one. But that's not true. It turns out that making a big decision or making a small decision, no matter, making a small decision uses just as many cognitive resources as making big ones. This is sometimes what people refer to as decision fatigue, and you've experienced this, I'm sure. At some point, I'm sometimes this way after giving a lecture, where somebody will talk to me and want me to make a decision. It's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? I can't even, think straight. And that happens simply because of my probably depleted glucose. Worse, multitasking increases cortisol. So cortisol is kind of a stress hormone. And when you get that for a long period of time, it's not good for you. It can, cause mental fog, scrambled thinking, even make us dizzy. So divided attention doesn't work terribly well. This is some work, I believe, from Tim Strayer at University of Utah, if I recall. I wonder if it was Frank Drews in this too. Yeah, probably. But this was called... Actually, I'm wrong about this one. Must be that those cognitive resources getting away from me. This one, I think, was the Virginia Tech. This was the Virginia Tech 100-car naturalistic driving study. Basically, what they did is they placed video recorders in cars and watched about how the cell phone, even just having it in the car, changed the likelihood of getting into a car accident. And here's what they found. The risk of an accident increased 4 times when using a cell phone. So you can see those on the right. And in fact, they used a number of measures. They used accidents, but this is simply the number of red lights missed. Here's Strayer and Johnson. So these are the guys at Utah. They did a simulated driving task. So we have a driving simulator at ASU in Professor Gray's lab. So you can replicate these kinds of studies if you want or extend them. They did a simulated driving task, and participants on cell phones missed twice as many red lights and took longer to apply the brakes. And these things happen when they were using a hands-free cell phone as well as just in holding the cell phone. So hands-free did not help them very much, which tells us that what's happening is if we're paying attention to a conversation that we're having, we're not paying attention to the road very well. It's not necessarily a visual thing or a hands thing. It's something else cognitively that's going on. Basically, we're using mental effort in 2 different ways, and there's only so much mental effort to go around. Here's another thing you've probably noticed about attention. We get bored. So humans, if you think again, going back to evolutionary perspective, paying attention to the same thing time and time and time again for long periods of time probably wasn't very helpful to us. We probably wanted to go about our work or maybe even our mind wandering, but then when there was a big change, we should notice it very easily, because if there's no change and you're doing just fine, you'll probably keep doing fine. So we're really terrible at sustained attention. We're really terrible at paying attention to long things for a long period of time. So things like the TSA agents at airports, the folks that, scan for bombs and all kinds of other nasty things. They have a very difficult time staying on task for any long period of time. For one, because people don't bring bombs, thankfully, very often through the TSA. So here's what ends up happening. Basically, they're pretty good at vigilance. Like if we send through a fake bomb, they're pretty good at detecting it early on in the first 10 minutes or so of doing their task. But then it really begins to fall off even when we get down here to about, 22 and a half minutes, 25 minutes, something like that. And then it begins to plateau over here. So that's called the vigilance decrement. And it turns out it's just saying that people are not great at detecting signals over long periods of time. So what are some things we can help people do when we're designing tasks and when we're designing products and things like that to improve their sustained attention? One is to make sure that we're alternating work and rest quite a bit. Another is to alternate tasks. That is, don't give them two things to pay attention to at once, but they should stop doing one task, take a little break, start another one, take a little break, start another one, etc. We could make the signals larger. So maybe we had a computer system that anything that looks like, even possibly like a bomb, maybe that makes that bigger. Maybe it outlines it to help them make decisions. So there's a lot of those kinds of things we can do. I'll just have you read this at your own leisure. So by all means, we want to do things like minimize attention switching costs. Remember, when we're dividing our attention or moving from one thing to another very quickly, it fatigues us quite a bit. So one of the ways we can do that is to organize displays by importance. So for example, we can place the critical information people need in the center 30 degrees of visual field. And I think I mentioned how to measure that in the book. Use movement in your visual periphery, blinking and things like that, only for critical warnings. So the issue is that if something, you've probably experienced this before, if something is moving in your visual periphery, or if it's blinking in your visual periphery, not exactly where you're looking, you automatically pay attention to that. You have no choice, it's obligatory. It automatically, your mind will orient to it. So if that's the case, and it is, you need to make sure that you only use blinking and things like that for the most critical things. So for example, a patient is in risk of dying, or there's a car coming at you very fast from the right-hand side and might T-bone you if you drive out into the intersection, things like that. Okay. We also want to organize the display according to frequency of use. Those items that we use most often should be amongst the easiest to find and the easiest to see. Then the next ones have to do with grouping. That is, we need to group our items according to similarity and co-occurrence. If you combine those two, similarity and co-occurrence, you can think of them as relatedness. And then finally, but like things together, obviously. And then finally, we need to enable side-by-side comparisons. So don't put information on one screen that people have to remember for something on the next screen. If they're going to need to remember it, make sure that you have things side by side. Okay, so that's our first foray into attention. We'll talk more about it and so forth as we continue our discussion of cognition. So thank you, and I'll look forward to talking to you next time. Bye.